Dust Creek was dying long before the Bloodjaw gang ever wandered near it. The frontier had a cruel way of shrinking towns the same way the sun shriveled riverbeds, slowly, then suddenly, until nothing remained but memories and dust. Dust Creek clung to life like an old, stubborn mule. Its wooden storefronts leaned sideways from wind damage, its water troughs dried up by noon, and its front doors forever lined with sand blown in by the ceaseless desert wind. That wind was a strange one. It carved the main street like a knife, sweeping thin trails of grit past the shuttered windows and faded posters. When it howled, folks said it sounded like a ghost telling stories, old stories that the town preferred to forget. The Last Lantern Saloon, the oldest building still standing straight, flickered with light each evening. Its lanterns fought the dusk with weak yellow flame, their cracked glass trembling in the breeze that forced its way in whenever the doors swung open. Inside, the saloon breathed a tired kind of warmth. Men nursed drinks more out of habit than pleasure. The piano in the corner hadn't been tuned in years, and its keys sounded like a dying bird when old Benny attempted a tune. Behind the bar, Mr. Cranley wiped glasses that never truly looked clean. Folks spoke in low tones, careful and slow, as if any louder sound might break the fragile peace Dust Creek depended on to keep going. At a small table near the back sat Elias Crow, the oldest farmer around and perhaps the quietest man in 3 counties. He was thin, almost lanky, but his shoulders held the posture of someone who once carried weight heavier than hay bales or water buckets. His hair had turned the color of winter frost, and his beard followed suit. He favored his left leg with a noticeable limp that made every step look painful, though he never once complained about it. Most townsfolk had never heard him raise his voice. The few who did claimed even his anger sounded soft, like a man apologizing for being upset. Young cowhands chuckled about him sometimes. Old Elias is harmless, they'd say, tossing cards on the table. Man ain't got enough fire left to snap a twig. He only comes here so the dust on his clothes can drink for him. But the older men, the ones with scars from the Apache Wars or from nights spent fighting rustlers, never joined in the laughter. They'd simply turn their eyes away, frown a little, or tap the rim of their hat, because they knew things these young ones didn't, things they'd never speak aloud. The evening quiet broke when the doors slammed open with a gust that scattered playing cards from tables. The lanterns flickered, shadows jumped, and the already thin air seemed to shrink. Brett Harlow had arrived. A drunken grin hung on his face, and his boots stomped the floor like he thought the whole town owed him applause. His black coat swung behind him, revealing the silver-studded holster hanging at his hip. The blurred tattoos across his knuckles spelled out blood, though the last letter had been ink crooked. He smelled of rot-gut whiskey, sweat, and the kind of trouble that came with outlaws who fancied themselves legends. Everyone knew Brett Harlow even if they wished they didn't. He ran errands with a Bloodjaw gang, sometimes riding with them, sometimes sneaking ahead to scout. He wasn't the fastest gun among them. He wasn't the smartest or strongest either. But he was reckless, loud, and proud to be tied to men who spilled blood like it cost nothing. Brett staggered toward the bar, shoving aside a pair of miners who were too slow to move. "Whiskey," he barked, slamming his fist down. "Good kind. Not that swamp juice you feed these mule heads." Cranley poured him a drink without a word. No one dared provoke Brett, not even with a glance. When trouble carries a gang's reputation, folks learn to lower their eyes and hope the storm passes quick. Brett drank deep, coughed, then laughed. "Damn. Burns like my ex-wife's cooking." He threw the empty glass over his shoulder. It shattered near Elias's boots. Elias stared down at the shards, dust settling over them. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture for another drink. He simply waited, still and patient, as if he'd seen far worse things than a drunk outlaw with poor manners. Brett, noticing the stillness, turned his attention toward the older men. "Well, look at here," he slurred. "The scarecrow ain't even flinching. You deaf, old-timer? Or just stupid?" A few snickers broke from young men who should have known better. The older ones, the few who understood the danger, looked away, their jaws tightening. Elias didn't raise his head, didn't blink, didn't show any sign he'd heard Brett at all. That made Brett angrier. He stormed toward Elias's table, swaggering like a rooster ready for a fight. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Grandpa." Elias finally lifted his eyes. They were gray as storm clouds. "Calm. Too calm." "Evening," he said simply. Brett froze for a moment, confused by the gentle reply. Then the confusion twisted into rage. "You making fun of me?" "No, son," Elias said softly. Just being polite. Son. That was the spark. With a drunken roar, Brett grabbed Elias by the collar and shoved him backward. Elias stumbled, his bad leg folding under him. The wooden chair scraped hard across the floor before toppling with him. The old farmer landed flat on his back, a grunt escaping him. The saloon went dead still. Even the wind seemed to stop. Old Benny's fingers hovered above the piano keys, frozen mid-song. Cranley stood behind the bar, rag dangling from his numb hand. The miners near the fireplace held their breath. Something about seeing Elias Khrushcheved, violently, not playfully, froze time. Brett swayed over him, laughing too loud. That'll teach you not to act big. But it wasn't the shove that made the room go silent. It was what came after. Elias didn't scramble or groan or curse. He didn't plead or even glare. He pushed his palms against the floor and rose slowly, so slowly it looked deliberate. Every inch of the movement radiated control, steadiness, and something else. Something deep. When he finally stood, he brushed dust off his coat, straightened it, and looked at Brett with the same gentle patience as before. "You all right?" he asked, not himself, but Brett. The outlaw blinked. "What?" "I'm fine, you old." Elias nodded. "Good. Then no harm done." He turned to leave. But Brett didn't know when to quit. "Run along then," he shouted. "Tell your chickens the tale of how Brett Harlow whipped you so bad you—" Elias didn't answer. Didn't even turn around. He walked toward the swinging doors with that same slow, steady limp. Behind Brett, someone whispered. An older rancher whose voice trembled slightly. He shouldn't have done that. Boy doesn't know who Elias used to be. A cold shiver crept down the backs of every man close enough to hear. The younger cowhands frowned in confusion. Used to be. Elias had never been anything but a farmer, right? Another voice, a gray-bearded miner, added under his breath, "Some things are better left unprovoked." Brett scoffed loudly. "You bunch of cowards. He's just an old mule with a busted leg." He raised his drink high. "And I, Brett Harlow, just made him bow." He downed the last swallow with triumphant sloppiness. But in the far corner, where shadows clung like cobwebs, old Marshal Tooley shook his head. "Nah," he muttered. The old man didn't bow. He rose. No one heard him. Outside, the saloon doors swung shut behind Elias, and the desert wind greeted him like an old friend returning. It carried a different sound now, sharper, colder, a whisper tucked beneath the grit. Elias paused on the wooden porch, fingertips brushing the railing as if steadying himself from an invisible weight. He stared across the open desert, where twilight deepened and the horizon glowed faintly red. Something in his eyes changed. Something ancient, buried, long restrained. A memory. A fire. A name once spoken with fear. The wind tugged at his coat, urging him, reminding him. Elias Crow inhaled slowly, deeply. Elias Crow walked into the fading dusk with a stiffness that didn't come from age but from something older, an ache he had carried for 2 decades. Brett Harlow's shove had been nothing, a drunk boy's stumble of pride. But the moment Elias hit the saloon floor and rose with that eerie calm, something ancient stirred inside him, like embers receiving their first breath of wind after years under cold ash. As he walked the outskirts of Dust Creek, the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and smoke. Memories clung to it, drifting over him in thin, slicing flashes. A canyon echoing with gunfire. Moonlight glinting off a blade. Footprints in the sand that he knew how to read better than scripture. A wolf's cry weaving through the night like a prophecy. Men whispering his name with dread. The cinder wolf. That had been him, not the quiet farmer tending a mule and a dying patch of corn, but a shadow who hunted outlaws across the frontier, a tracker with instincts so sharp he could hear lies in a man's breath and smell gun oil before a fight. For years, his legend had grown like wildfire. Mothers used his name to frighten their sons into obedience. Bandits left loot behind if word came he was tracking them. And every scar on his body had a story told in the kind of silence only death created. But legends burned bright and fast, and his ended the night he came home to find flames devouring his cabin, the world he built collapsing into embers. His wife's screams appeared in every flicker of fire, until her voice was gone and only the howl of the wind remained. After that night, he buried his guns, buried his rage, and buried the name the frontier had carved into him. He became Elias Crow, the harmless farmer. Yet as he walked now toward a lonely hill north of Dust Creek, he felt that other self rising like smoke in the lungs. His senses sharpened. He could hear boots on gravel a mile away. He could smell the metal of a distant campfire spot. Even his shadow stretched differently, longer, sharper. At the crest of the hill stood a wooden cross. The desert wind tugged at the dry grass surrounding it, whispering over the grave like a mother hushing a child. Elias removed his hat and knelt. The wood of the cross was worn smooth from the touch of his fingers over the years. He traced her name with a thumb, the letters nearly invisible now. "I tried," he murmured. "Lord knows I tried." His voice cracked like old timber. But there's only so much peace in a mun before it starts suffocating him. The wind mourned with him, bending the shrubs and carrying distant echoes of horses. He listened, automatically, instinctively, the way he used to when tracking gangs across open country. The sound of hooves wasn't close yet, but it was coming. Too many riders to be travelers. The Bloodjaw gang. He bowed his head once more, then rose with a heaviness that felt like breaking a vow. His boots carried him to the lone dead cottonwood at the edge of the hill. Beneath its twisted roots, half buried in hard-packed soil, lay the past he'd sworn never to unearth. He dug with his hands, grit scraping his knuckles until they bled. When his fingers struck steel, his breath stilled. The lockbox was rusted, the hinges caked in red dust. He pried it open, and there they were, two blackened revolvers with pearl grips dull by time, and a knife with a wolf's head engraved into the hilt. The blade glinted faintly in the dusk, catching the dying light as if hungry for a darker night. His heart hammered slow, painful beats. These weapons were symbols of a men he thought he'd buried, of blood spilled, of the flame that took the only woman he'd ever loved. But they were also the tools he needed now, because the Bloodjaw gang would not spare Dust Creek. They never had mercy, only appetite. He pulled the belt from the box and strapped the revolvers around his hips. The leather felt foreign at first, stiff and old. But as he adjusted the weight, it settled around him with uncanny familiarity, like a second skin waking from slumber. He slid the knife into his boot. His limp straightened. His posture rose. His breath deepened. Lights flickered in the town below as evening shadows bled into night. Elias walked down the hill, and along Main Street curtains twitched as folks peeked out. The old scarred men went pale, recognizing the silhouette they'd heard rumors about but never dared confirm. The youngers whispered nervously. Elias didn't speak to any of them. Didn't need to. By the time the sun vanished, lanterns glowed like dying coals outside the Last Lantern Saloon. The town was too quiet. Even the wind hesitated. Dust Creek felt like a match waiting to be struck. And then the thunder of hooves rolled in. The Bloodjaw gang, 12 riders deep, stormed into town with laughter that curdled the air. Brett Harlow rode near the front, waving a bottle overhead like a trophy. Their horses kicked sand across doorsteps as they circled the main street, firing pistols into the sky. "Come on out, Dust Creek," someone hollered. "We're thirsty, bored, and ready to be entertained." A window shattered under a stray bullet. Women ducked behind doors, pulling children beneath tables. The sheriff's office stood empty, its occupant long gone after the Bloodjaws warned him to leave or be buried. Brett dismounted, stumbling slightly but still riding the thrill of the morning's bravado. "Where's the old scarecrow?" he shouted. "I got more lessons to teach." Laughter echoed behind him, loud, cruel, oblivious. Elias stepped out from the alley beside the general store, his face half lit by lantern glow, half swallowed by shadow. His coat billowed gently around him, revealing just enough metal on his hips to make the nearest outlaw stiffen. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His stillness was louder than the gang's entire ruckus. Brett turned, squinting. For a moment he didn't recognize the mun before him. The limp was gone. The posture taller. The eyes sharper, cold enough to freeze whiskey mid-swallow. "Who the hell were you supposed to be?" Brett asked. One of the older Bloodjaw riders, the only one among them with gray beginning to thread his beard, stared harder. His pupils shrank. His breath caught. A tremor rippled through him. "Boss," he whispered hoarsely. "That's him." "Him who?" Brett frowned. "The Cinder Wolf." The name traveled through the gang like a rattlesnake crawling across their graves. Every outlaw stiffened. Some looked around as though expecting to find an escape path that didn't exist. Others instinctively rested hands on their holsters, though they didn't draw. Not yet. Brett blanched beneath his bravado. "That's just a story." The older rider shook his head. "Stories don't wear guns like that. Stories don't look at you like they're measier in your coffin boards." Elias moved a step closer, and the gang stepped back as one. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough to be mistaken for the wind. "Leave Dust Creek." No threats. No curses. No boasts. Just a command delivered with calm finality, the kind a man issues when he knows the outcome of a fight before it begins. Brett swallowed hard, his hand twitching near his gun. "You think we're scared of some old ghost?" Elias didn't answer. His eyes simply locked on Brett's, steady and unblinking. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until even the horses snorted uneasily. This was not the harmless old farmer Brett had shoved hours earlier. This was a man built for tracking monsters, and becoming one when needed. The wind picked up, swirling dust around Elias's boots like the desert itself recognized him. He stood with the stillness of a wolf right before the lunge, the entire town watching from cracks between curtains. Mothers hushed crying children. The older men nodded grimly, memories of the past surfacing like bodies in a river. Elias felt a conflict twisting in his chest. Peace had been his promise, vengeance his curse. For 20 years he'd carried guilt heavy as chainmail. He didn't want to be the cinder wolf again, didn't want to reopen the wound that never healed. Moonlight bled across Dust Creek like a silver wound, stretching long shadows between buildings that creaked and groaned beneath the restless wind. Dust spun through the air in thin spirals, scraping against windows and rattling the warped saloon sign until it tapped like an impatient finger. The lanterns hanging outside glowed with a deep, uneasy red, their flames twisting wildly as if they sensed the violence that had seeped into the night. Inside the last lantern saloon, fear sat heavier than the smell of spilled whiskey. The Bloodjaw gang had forced half the town inside, shoving men to the floor and pulling women from doorways. Chairs overturned. Bottles smashed. A child whimpered before his mother clasped a hand over his mouth. The gang barked orders and threats, their boots thudding like drums of war across the wooden floorboards. Brett Harlow paced in front of the bar, waving his pistol with a shaky pride that didn't reach his eyes. He shouted for silence every few minutes, though no one dared speak. He knocked lanterns aside, uncaring as glass shattered and oil splashed across the counter. The red glow from outside crept through the windows, painting the room with an eerie, blood-colored hue. "Where's he hiding?" Brett snarled. "Where's that old bastard?" No one answered. They didn't need to. The fear trembling through the room told him Elias Crow was close. Outside, the wind carried the low groan of swinging shutters, the distant clatter of a loose sign banging against a post. And beneath it all, something else. A silence that felt alive, hunting through the alleys. Elias moved through that silence like it belonged to him. He slipped between buildings with steps softer than a desert cat. His long shadow blended with the night as he studied boot prints etched faintly in dust, fresh, heavy, unskilled. Bloodjaw prints. He knew each man by stride and weight, even after 20 years away from a life. He paused at the corner of the saloon, nostrils flaring slightly. Wood smoke. Gun oil. Sweat. A trace of cheap whiskey. He could read it all. He could hear the shuddering breath of hostages inside, could distinguish Brett's slurred voice from the lower growls of his fellow riders. He took one more step, and the memory of him as the Cinder Wolf returned to the minds of the hidden townsfolk. Inside their homes, old men whispered stories they once swore to never repeat. Elias had saved entire settlements back in the day, tracking abducted families through blizzards, starving himself to shadow a killer across the mountains, standing alone against gangs twice the size of Bloodjaw. "He saved my pa," one man murmured in a quivering voice. "He saved my brother," another whispered. "He saved all of us once," an older woman breathed, clutching her shawl. "And we never thanked him." Tonight, the men they dismissed as a gentle farmer moved through their streets like a ghost reclaimed by the frontier. Inside the saloon, Brett pressed the barrel of his gun beneath the bartender's chin. "Tell me where he is." "He'll come for you," Cranley whispered, voice low but steady. Brett hesitated, just long enough for that whisper of doubt to sink into his bones. His hand trembled despite the alcohol burning in his veins. "He ain't no legend," he muttered to himself. "He's just a man." Elias slipped through the back door so quietly that not even the nearest outlaw noticed until a faint shift of air brushed his neck. A gun clicked. Elias struck first, quick, silent, sending the men crumpling without a shot fired. He eased the outlaw to the floor, fingers steady, eyes calm. Then he disappeared into the smoke-haze shadows, stalking forward. He moved like he remembered every inch of the saloon from years ago. He stepped over a loose floorboard without noise. He pressed against a pillar just as another outlaw turned to check behind him. Elias caught him with a swift blow to the jaw. The man dropped before he understood what hit him. The hostages watched in stunned awe. They had heard rumors, tales whispered by weary travelers around campfires. But seeing Elias now, sharp, disciplined, unflinching, was like watching a legend rebuilt in flesh. Brett turned at the sound of a groan from the floor, and the moment he saw one of his own unconscious, he panicked. He's here. He's in here. Chaos erupted. Outlaws scrambled, guns shaking in their hands. Lantern light flickered wildly against the walls, making it hard to tell shadows from men. Brett fired blindly toward the back, bullets punching into barrels of ale and sending streams of liquor spilling across the floor. Elias stepped into view only when he wanted to. His silhouette emerged from the haze, straight-backed, steady-eyed, revolvers drawn but held low. "Brett," he said. Just the name. Brett flinched violently. His gun clattered against the bar as he fumbled to lift it. His hands wouldn't obey him. His face drained of color, sweat rolling down his temples. "Stay back," Brett yelled, voice cracking. "I ain't afraid of you." His trembling said otherwise. Elias moved with unnerving calm. One step. Another. Then another. The closer he came, the more the younger outlaw shook. His pistol wavered, jerking with each breath. "Put it down," Elias said. "No one needs to die tonight." Brett fired. The bullet grazed the lantern, sending sparks flying. Before the outlaw could even process the shot, Elias lifted his arm and fired once. Brett's gun snapped out of his grasp, flying across the room and skidding to a stop beneath a table. The Bludger gang roared, guns drawn, diving behind overturned chairs and barrels. Elias slipped behind a pillar as bullets tore splinters from the wood. He moved to the left, letting their fire guide his steps. They didn't know the saloon like he did. They didn't know how shadows bent or how sound carried in the narrow corridors of the old structure. Elias used the chaos as a map. He ghosted through the room, firing precision shots that struck pistols cleanly from hands or knocked out lanterns to plunge corners into darkness. One outlaw rushed him with a knife. Elias twisted, disarmed him, and sent him crashing across a table with a boot to the chest. Another tried climbing to the roof beams for a higher vantage point. Elias shot the beam near his hand, sending him tumbling into a pile of chairs. The fight spilled into the alley behind the saloon. Gunfire flashed between the buildings, lighting up the dust storm beginning to spiral through town. Elias used the wind, timing his advances with its howl to mask his steps. He scaled a low rooftop with ease, sliding across it to drop behind two gang members attempting to flank him. They never saw him coming. Their guns clashed against the ground. Through the smoke and dust, Elias locked eyes with Brett again. The outlaw crawled backward until he hit the wall of the saloon. His breath came quick, panicked. Without a weapon now, he looked smaller than he ever had before, just a reckless boy who stumbled into the path of a storm he couldn't comprehend. "You burned her," Elias said quietly. Brett froze. What are you talking about?" he stammered. Elias advanced slowly, voice trembling with something deeper than rage. "My ranch. 20 years ago. A fire that took everything I had." Brett's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that wasn't there. I don't know nothing about." But Elias saw it. The flicker in his eyes. The guilt buried in panic. "You were there," Elias whispered. "You lit the torch." Brett's breath shuddered. His denial melded into silence. "I didn't know it was your place," Brett finally whispered. "We were paid to burn it. Didn't know who lived there. Didn't know about your wife." The world narrowed to those words. Elias felt something break inside him, an old wound ripping open, heat and grief flooding through him like fire reaching fresh timber. His hand tightened around the revolver until his knuckles whitened. The urge to end Brett right there slammed into him with the weight of all 20 years of torment. Brett shut his eyes, waiting for the gunshot. But Dust Creek watched. The canyons east of Dust Creek rose like jagged ribs of the earth, carved by centuries of wind and water into twisted shapes that loomed beneath the bleeding red light of dusk. Shadows stretched long across the sand as the sun slipped behind the cliffs, turning the whole world into a crimson chamber where the wind howled through narrow gaps like wolves mourning the dead. Dust spiraled through the air, carrying the smell of iron and stone, and the kind of silence that warned of men hiding with guns drawn. The last remnants of the Bloodjaw gang had run here, dragging their wounded pride with them, believing the canyon walls would protect them. They were wrong. The frontier had a long memory, and so did Elias Crow. He followed their tracks with the ease of a man who had once tracked killers through blizzards and deserts alike. Every broken twig, every disturbed pebble, every boot print half buried beneath drifting sand. He read them all as if the land itself whispered directions in his ear. The canyon wind tugged at his coat as he walked, its cold fingers trying to push him back, as though the earth feared the storm he was becoming. The remaining gang members gathered beyond a bend, hidden within the canyon's jagged throat. The lieutenant, a tall, scarred man named Vance Raleigh, watched the entrance with a rifle across his knees. His eyes darted between the shadows and the sky, as if expecting thunderbolts to fall instead of bullets. "He's coming," one outlaw muttered, voice trembling. "Brett said he's the Cinder Wolf, said he ain't human." Vance spat into the sand. "Every man bleeds. Every man dies. He ain't no different." But his voice shook just enough that the others noticed. He'd heard the stories too, the ones whispered around campfires by men who claimed the Cinder Wolf tracked them for days without leaving footprints. Stories of impossible shots taken through storms. Stories of shadows moving where no shadows should be. The canyon wind carried footsteps then. Soft, almost imaginary. Vance raised his fist, signaling silence. The men froze, guns aimed at the entrance. The red dusk light pulsed against the canyon walls like a heartbeat. Another sound followed. A scrape. A shift. A whisper of sand sliding. Vance leaned forward. Nothing moved. Then Elias appeared, only for a blink, atop the canyon ridge, silhouetted against the dying sky. A ghost. A vision. A memory wearing flesh. Gunfire erupted upward, bullets ricocheting against stone, sparks flying. But Elias wasn't there anymore. The ridge lay empty, dust swirling where he had stood. "He's everywhere," someone gasped. "He's—" A hand shot from the shadows behind him. Elias grabbed the outlaw by the collar, slammed him into the canyon wall, and knocked him unconscious with the hilt of his revolver. Before another could fire, Elias melted back into the darkness like a wolf vanishing between trees. Two more gunmen rushed the narrow pass, firing blindly. Elias dropped from a ledge above them, landing with the silent grace of a predator. His boots barely made a sound as he swept one outlaw's legs out from under him, seized the other's wrist, and twisted until the pistol clattered to the ground. He disarmed them with a precision that felt almost unreal. Quick, practiced, merciless in speed but measured in intent. He didn't kill them. He didn't have to. Fear did the crippling for him. Vance's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he watched his men fall without Elias ever firing a killing shot. "Show yourself, Crow," he shouted, voice echoing against the reddened cliffs. "You think you're some ghost?" Elias stepped from behind a boulder, his revolver pointed at the ground. His coat flapped sharply as the canyon wind seized it. His eyes were calm. Too calm. A man ready to kill feels rage. A man ready to die feels fear. But Elias felt neither. He only felt purpose. "Your men are down," Elias said. "You don't need to follow them." Vance steadied his rifle. "You took my gang apart. You expect me to walk? I expect you to choose." Vance snarled, lifting the rifle to aim. But Elias moved faster. A single shot cracked through the canyon. Vance's rifle spun out of his grip, the bullet striking it dead center without touching his hands. The lieutenant stumbled back in disbelief. His weapon lay useless on the ground, its barrel split. "You ain't just a tracker," Vance whispered. "You're the damn devil." Elias said nothing. He walked forward slowly, closing the distance, the wolf-engraved knife glinting at his belt. Vance drew a pistol from his boot, desperate and wild, firing twice. Elias twisted to the side, the bullet sparking Avrock. He lunged, grabbed Vance's wrist, and slammed him into the canyon wall. The pistol fell. Vance gasped for breath as Elias pressed him against the stone, the cold muzzle of a revolver resting beneath his jaw. "Tell me who paid you to burn that ranch," Elias said, voice trembling with a fury he barely contained. Vance choked. "A man named Calder. Calder Flint. Big rancher south of Grady Ridge. Wanted the land cleared. Paid good." The name hit Elias like a blow to the chest. He stepped back slowly, lowering his gun. Calder Flint had been a respected man once. A wealthy cattle magnate. A name spoken in town like law. And he had paid to destroy Elias's life. Vance collapsed, breathing in ragged gulps. "We didn't know she was inside," he whispered. "Didn't know it was you we wronged." Elias stared down at him, every muscle trembling. He could end Vance right there. The canyon would swallow the sound. The world would agree the man deserved it. But killing him would only carve another scar in a heart already split by too many. "Go," Elias said finally, stepping aside. Vance blinked in confusion. What? You heard me. Crawl if you have to. And don't ever ride west again. The lieutenant scrambled away, disappearing into the shadows with the broken remains of his pride. The canyon fell silent again. Elias turned toward the entrance, where Brett Harlow had been watching from atop his horse. Brett's eyes were wide with terror, his lips trembling. He had stayed behind out of fear, unable to ride with the others yet too afraid to face Elias. Elias approached slowly, steady as the wind, stopping just a few feet away. Brett slid off the horse and collapsed to his knees. I know I should die for what I did, Brett said, voice cracking. I won't beg. I ain't got the right. Elias stared at him, torn between two worlds, the men he had become and the monster the frontier remembered. I ain't killing you, Elias said finally. Brett's head jerked up in disbelief. You're going east. Past the river. Past the flats. You step back into this territory again, you won't walk out. Brett nodded frantically. Tears carved paths through the dust on his face. I'll go. I swear it. Good, Elias said softly. Then the blood ends tonight. Brett rode away without looking back, a broken silhouette swallowed by the canyon's throat. When Elias returned to Dust Creek, dawn was breaking. The sky blushed orange and gold over the rooftops, lanterns still glowing dimly as townsfolk stepped outside, cautious at first, then hopeful when they saw him. He walked through their midst, not with swagger or pride, but with the quiet endurance of a man who had carried too much for too long. They looked at him differently now, not as the old farmer with a limp, not as the lonely widower tending dying crops, but as something older and stronger, a guardian carved by the land itself. Mothers held their children closer, whispering gratitude. Old men tipped their hats with respect born of memory and relief. Young cowhands stared with newfound reverence. Elias paused beside the well, his gaze lifting to the horizon where the canyons glowed like embers cooling after a long burn. A soft voice behind him, Cranley's, broke the silence. You ain't just flesh and bone, Elias. Elias didn't respond, but his eyes softened. Far off, the canyon wind howled like a wolf greeting the morning.